In the quiet town of Crimson Valley, where Victorian mansions stand like silent witnesses to decades of secrets, 72-year-old Josephine Harrington lived alone in the grandest house on Maple Hill. To the townspeople, she was just a wealthy, eccentric widow who rarely ventured beyond her iron gates. But to Jackson Reed, a 38-year-old con man with a silver tongue and practiced smile, she was his next target, perhaps his biggest score yet. What Jackson didn't know was that behind Josephine's fragile appearance and seemingly naive demeanor lay the mind of a woman who had been underestimated her entire life, and she was tired of it. This is the story of how a charming con man thought he'd found the perfect victim, only to discover that the widow had been setting a trap of her own all along. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jackson Reed sat at his usual corner table in the Grindstone Cafe on Main Street, his leather portfolio opened just enough to display what appeared to be financial documents. His Rolex watch, fake but convincingly so, caught the light as he raised his coffee cup. At 38, Jackson had perfected his appearance, salt and pepper hair that suggested wisdom beyond his years, tailored suits that hinted at success without flaunting wealth, and eyes that could transform from calculating to compassionate in an instant. Another refill, Mr. Reed? Asked Sarah, the young barista who had developed a crush on the mysterious financial advisor who appeared in Crimson Valley 3 months ago. Not today, Sarah. Jackson smiled warmly. I've got an important meeting with a new client, but thank you, as always. Sarah blushed and retreated. Jackson's smile faded as he returned to studying the newspaper clipping in his portfolio. An obituary from 14 months ago. Edmund Harrington, 78, prominent industrialist and philanthropist, passed away peacefully at his home on Maple Hill. He is survived by his wife of 50 years, Josephine Harrington. Jackson had been researching Josephine for weeks. Edmund Harrington had built his fortune in manufacturing during the post-war boom, leaving his widow with a substantial estate valued at approximately $8.7 million. No children, no close family. Just an elderly woman living alone in a 22-room Victorian mansion with more money than she could spend in what remained of her lifetime. Jackson closed his portfolio and checked his reflection in his phone screen. He smoothed an imaginary wrinkle from his jacket and rehearsed his opening line. One last time! This would be their first chance encounter, though he had orchestrated every detail meticulously. The Crimson Valley Farmers Market was in full swing as Jackson made his way through the Saturday morning crowd. He had learned from his research that Josephine Harrington made a rare public appearance every Saturday at precisely 10:15 a.m. to purchase fresh flowers and speak with Mrs. Abernathy, the only flower vendor who still carried the heritage roses that Edmund had given Josephine. On their wedding day, as the church bell tower struck the quarter hour, Jackson spotted her, a petite woman with silver hair pulled into an elegant chignon, her posture still remarkably straight despite her years. She wore a pale blue dress with a matching cardigan, pearl earrings, and carried a handcrafted willow basket. The outfit probably cost more than most people in the market made in a month. Jackson waited until she had completed her purchase, then timed his path to intersect with hers just as she turned from the flower stall. He bumped into her gently, not enough to knock her down, but sufficient to send a few roses tumbling from her basket. "Oh my goodness, I am so terribly sorry, ma'am," Jackson exclaimed, immediately crouching to retrieve the fallen flowers. "Please forgive my clumsiness." Josephine looked down at him, her blue eyes sharp and clear behind silver-framed glasses. "No harm done, young man," she said, her voice surprisingly strong, "though I suspect these roses have suffered a bruising." Jackson straightened, offering the recovered flowers with a chagrined smile. "I'm afraid you're right. Please, allow me to replace them." He turned toward the flower stall, but Josephine's gloved hand touched his arm lightly. That won't be necessary. These roses are more resilient than they look, much like their owner. A hint of amusement played at the corners of her mouth. Jackson nodded respectfully. Then perhaps you'll allow me to make amends another way? A cup of tea, perhaps? The Maple Leaf Bakery across the street makes an excellent Earl Grey. Josephine studied him for a moment, as if weighing something in her mind. I haven't been to the Maple Leaf in years. My late husband and I used to go there when we were courting. She paused, then added, Very well, Mr. Reed. Jackson Reed, he supplied, offering his arm with old-fashioned courtesy. It would be my honor, Mrs. Harrington. A flicker of surprise crossed her features. You know who I am? Jackson's response was practiced, the perfect blend of respect and casual recognition. Of course. Your husband was a legend in these parts. Edmund Harrington's philanthropy built half the town. The children's wing of the hospital bears your family name. It would be difficult to live in Crimson Valley and not know of the Harringtons. Josephine's expression softened slightly. Well, Mr. Reed, let's see if the Maple Leaf's Earl Grey is as good as I remember it. Bell tinkling as they enter the bakery, soft ambient sounds. The bakery was warm and fragrant with the smell of fresh bread and pastries. Jackson guided Josephine to a quiet corner table, pulling out her chair with practiced gallantry. He ordered tea for both of them, along with a selection of scones that he insisted on paying for despite Josephine's protest. So, Mr. Reed, what brings you to our little town? Josephine asked, stirring a small spoonful of honey into her tea. You're obviously not a native of Crimson Valley. Jackson launched into his carefully crafted backstory. He was a financial advisor specializing in estate planning for elderly clients, recently relocated from Boston after a difficult divorce. He had chosen Crimson Valley for its charm and slower pace, hoping to rebuild his life and his practice in a place where personal connections still mattered. I've found that many older clients are taken advantage of by large firms that see them as numbers rather than people, Jackson explained, his expression earnest. I prefer to work with a smaller client base, providing personalized service and building relationships based on trust. Josephine listened attentively, occasionally asking surprisingly detailed questions about investment strategies and estate tax laws. Jackson was prepared, seamlessly delivering answers that demonstrated expertise without becoming overly technical. You seem quite knowledgeable, Mr. Reed, Josephine remarked as she dabbed her lips with a napkin. I imagine your clients find great comfort in your expertise. I hope so, Jackson replied modestly, though I must admit, my client list here is still rather small. Building trust takes time. Indeed it does, Josephine agreed, her gaze suddenly more penetrating than before. Trust is such a fragile thing, wouldn't you say? Once broken, almost impossible to repair. Something in her tone made Jackson pause, but he recovered quickly. Absolutely. That's why integrity is the cornerstone of my practice. Josephine smiled and glanced at the delicate watch on her wrist. Oh my, look at the time. I should be getting home. My gardener will be waiting for instructions about the new rose bushes. Of course, Jackson stood, helping her gather her belongings. May I walk you to your car? That's kind of you, but Winston is waiting with the car just outside, she replied, nodding toward the black town car parked across the street, where an elderly man in a chauffeur's cap sat at the wheel. As they stepped outside the bakery, Josephine turned to Jackson. I've enjoyed our conversation, Mr. Reed. Perhaps you would consider joining me for dinner at my home next Friday evening. I have some questions about my current investment portfolio that I'd value your opinion on. Jackson worked to keep his expression neutral, though inwardly he was elated. This was happening even faster than he had anticipated. I would be honored, Mrs. Harrington. What time should I arrive? 7 o'clock, she replied, then added with a small smile, and please call me Josephine. Josephine. Jackson repeated, taking her hand and bowing slightly. Until Friday. As Winston drove away with Josephine in the back seat, Jackson couldn't help but smile to himself. Phase 1 had gone perfectly. The wealthy widow seemed lonely, eager for company and, most importantly, impressed by his financial expertise. She was practically inviting him to examine her portfolio, opening the door to his eventual proposal to optimize her investments through his channels. What Jackson didn't see was the calculating look that crossed Josephine's face as the car pulled away, nor did he hear her instructions to Winston. Take me to Gloria's house and call Robert. Tell him we need to move the timeline forward. Our fish has taken the bait. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Harrington estate loomed against the twilight sky as Jackson's BMW crawled up the winding driveway. Maple Hill Manor was even more impressive up close. A 3-story Victorian masterpiece with wraparound porches, ornate gingerbread trim, and stained glass windows that glowed amber from within. Gas lamps flickered along the curved path, casting long shadows across manicured gardens that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. Jackson checked his appearance one last time, in the rearview mirror, adjusting his burgundy tie and smoothing back his hair. In the passenger seat lay a bottle of expensive Pinot Noir, not the most extravagant vintage, but costly enough to suggest taste without appearing ostentatious. Beside it, a small box of Belgian chocolates. Simple gifts, designed to charm without. Raising suspicion, he had spent the past 5 days researching Josephine even more thoroughly. Her late husband's company, Harrington Manufacturing, had been sold to a conglomerate 3 years before Edmund's death, netting the couple nearly $12 million after taxes. The foundation they established donated primarily to educational causes and the local hospital. Josephine served on several boards but had stepped back from most public duties after Edmund's passing. Most importantly, Jackson had confirmed through county records that the estate was solely in Josephine's name, with no trust restrictions. If he played his cards right, he could be managing her investments within a month, gradually siphoning funds into offshore accounts long before anyone noticed. Sound of car door closing, footsteps on gravel, doorbell chiming. The massive oak door opened to reveal not Josephine, but a tall, lean man in his 60s wearing a butler's uniform. "Mr. Reed, I presume?" the man asked, his voice carrying a slight southern drawl. "Yes, that's right," Jackson replied, offering his most charming smile. "I am Harrison, Mrs. Harrington's house manager. Please come in." The butler stepped aside, revealing an entrance hall that took Jackson's breath away. A sweeping staircase curved upward beneath a crystal chandelier that must have cost more than Jackson's entire apartment. Oil paintings in gilded frames lined walls covered in silk damask wallpaper. The marble floor gleamed like a mirror, reflecting antique furnishings that belonged in a museum. "Mrs. Harrington will receive you in the blue room," Harrison announced, leading Jackson through the hall. "She asks that you excuse the informality of this evening's arrangements. She prefers a more intimate setting for business discussions." Jackson followed, mentally cataloguing valuables as they passed. A Tiffany lamp here, what appeared to be an original Monet there. The intimate setting turned out to be a room that could have comfortably hosted 20 people, with ceiling-high bookshelves, a grand piano in one corner, and several seating areas arranged around a marble fireplace where a fire crackled softly. Josephine rose from a wing-back chair as they entered. She wore an elegant navy dress with a simple strand of pearls, her silver hair arranged in a loose chignon. Despite her age, she moved with remarkable grace. "Mr. Reed, how lovely to see you again," she greeted him, extending her hand. Jackson bowed slightly as he took it. "The pleasure is all mine, Josephine, and please call me Jackson. He presented the wine and chocolates, a small token of appreciation for your invitation. How thoughtful, she smiled, accepting his offerings. Harrison, please have Chef Thomas impair this lovely wine with our dinner. The butler nodded and disappeared silently. Please sit, Josephine gestured to the chair opposite hers. I hope you don't mind, but I've invited my financial manager to join us for dinner. Robert has handled my affairs since Edmund passed, and I thought it might be helpful for you both to meet. Jackson maintained his pleasant expression, though inwardly he cursed. A financial manager already in place complicated matters significantly. Of course, I'd be delighted to meet him. Excellent. He should be arriving shortly. Josephine settled back in her chair. In the meantime, perhaps you could tell me more about your approach to estate management. I found our conversation at the bakery quite enlightening. For the next 20 minutes, Jackson delivered a masterclass in financial double talk, sprinkling legitimate investment strategies with impressive sounding jargon and carefully crafted half-truths about his previous successes. Throughout, Josephine asked surprisingly pointed questions that kept him on his toes, but he navigated them smoothly, citing regulations and market trends with confidence. Your knowledge is impressive, Josephine remarked, her blue eyes assessing him carefully. Edmund always said that understanding the psychology of money was as important as understanding the markets themselves. Would you agree? Absolutely, Jackson replied. In fact, a knock at the door interrupted him as Harrison reappeared. Mrs. Harrington, Mr. Calloway has arrived. Wonderful. Show him in, Harrison. Josephine turned to Jackson. Robert has been delayed at meetings all day, poor man. He works too hard. Jackson stood as a man entered the room and immediately felt his stomach drop. Robert Calloway was not the elderly accountant type he had expected, but a sharp-looking man in his 50s with shrewd eyes and an athletic build. Worse, something about him seemed vaguely familiar, though Jackson couldn't quite place him. Robert, darling, thank you for coming on such short notice, Josephine said warmly, rising to greet him with a kiss on the cheek. I'd like you to meet Jackson Reed, the financial advisor I mentioned. Calloway extended his hand, his grip firm and assessing. Jackson Reed, interesting. Where did you say you were from originally? Boston, Jackson replied smoothly. Though, a warning bell sounded in his mind. Fascinating. I spent considerable time in Boston myself. Which firm were you with? Before Jackson could answer, Harrison reappeared to announce that dinner was served. Relieved by the interruption, Jackson offered his arm to Josephine and escorted her to the dining room, feeling Calloway's eyes on his back the entire way, sounds of silverware clinking against fine china. The dining room was another exhibition of wealth, a long mahogany table that could seat 20, set with Limoges china, crystal stemware and sterling silver flatware. Only one end was set for their intimate party of 3, with Josephine at the head and the men seated across from each other. As they dined on butter-poached lobster and truffle risotto, Calloway continued his subtle interrogation, asking about specific financial regulations that had changed recently and name-dropping senior partners at the top Boston firms. Jackson parried each question deftly, drawing on his extensive research and years of experience in financial scams. But he was working harder than he'd anticipated. So, Mr. Reed, Calloway said as they finished the main course, what exactly brings you to Crimson Valley? It seems an unusual choice for someone with your claimed expertise. Before Jackson could respond, Josephine interjected. Robert, you're being terribly rude. Mr. Reed has already explained that he came here seeking a quieter life after his divorce. She turned to Jackson with a sympathetic smile. Men like Robert can't imagine choosing peace over profit. It's why he'll die of a heart attack before he's 60, Calloway chuckled. You're probably right, as usual, Josie. Jackson noted the familiar nickname with interest. The relationship between Josephine and her financial manager seemed closer than strictly professional. After dinner, they returned to the Blue Room for coffee and brandy. As Harrison served them, Josephine turned to Jackson. "Perhaps now would be a good time to discuss my portfolio. I've been considering some changes." "I'd be happy to offer my insights," Jackson replied, accepting a snifter of amber liquid that probably cost more than his monthly rent. Josephine nodded to Harrison, who retrieved a leather portfolio from a desk drawer and handed it to her. She opened it, removing several documents which she passed to Jackson. "These are statements from my current investments," she explained. "As you can see, Edmund was rather conservative in his approach, mostly blue-chip stocks, municipal bonds, some treasury notes. Robert has maintained this strategy since Edmund's passing, but recently I've been wondering if a more dynamic approach might be warranted." Jackson examined the statements carefully, his pulse quickening as he confirmed what his research had suggested. Josephine's liquid assets exceeded $6 million, not counting the estate itself or various art collections. The potential score was even bigger than he'd thought. "I understand your thinking," he said, adopting a thoughtful expression. "With the right adjustments, we could potentially increase your returns by 12 to 15% annually, while still maintaining reasonable security." "That sounds promising," Josephine replied, though Jackson noticed Calloway's skeptical expression. "What would you suggest specifically?" Jackson outlined a strategy that sounded sophisticated and secure, but would actually give him significant control over her funds, exactly what he needed to begin his scheme. "Interesting approach," Calloway interjected when Jackson finished. "Though I notice you haven't mentioned the tax implications of such transfers, or the early withdrawal penalties from some of these instruments. Details that would be addressed in the implementation phase," Jackson countered smoothly. "The broad strategy is what matters at this stage." Josephine looked between the two men, then set down her coffee cup decisively. "Well, this has given me much to consider. Perhaps we should continue this discussion another time when we're all fresh." She turned to Jackson with a warm smile. "Would you be available to come back on Monday? Say, for lunch? I'd like to show you the gardens while they're still in bloom, and then we could discuss these matters further." "I'd be delighted," Jackson replied, recognizing the opportunity to get her alone, away from Calloway's scrutiny. As the evening concluded and Harrison showed him to the door, Jackson felt a mixture of excitement and unease. The potential payoff was enormous, but something about Robert Calloway bothered him. The man had been too pointed with his questions, too skeptical. Standing on the porch, Jackson shook Calloway's hand one final time. "A pleasure meeting you, Robert. I look forward to our next discussion." "Indeed," Calloway replied, his smile not reaching his eyes. "I'm sure it will be illuminating for all of us." As Jackson drove away from Maple Hill Manor, he checked his rearview mirror repeatedly, unable to shake the feeling that he had walked into something more complicated than a lonely widow with millions to spare. He needed to accelerate his timeline, get Josephine to trust him quickly, gain access to her accounts, and complete the con before Calloway could interfere. What Jackson didn't know was that as soon as his headlights disappeared down the winding drive, Josephine and Robert moved to Edmund's old study, where Harrison was already waiting with 3 glasses and a bottle of Macallan 25. "Well," Josephine asked, accepting her whiskey. "What do you think?" Robert loosened his tie and sank into a leather chair. "He's good, very good, but he slipped on the SEC filing requirements. No legitimate advisor would have missed that." Harrison nodded in agreement. "And his watch is a counterfeit. Excellent quality, but still fake." Josephine smiled, a hard glint in her eyes as she raised her glass. "Then we proceed as planned. Our Mr. Reed thinks he's found an easy mark. Let's show him just how wrong he is." The weekend passed agonizingly slowly for Jackson. He spent most of it in his rented apartment above the town's only real estate office, researching everything he could find about Robert Calloway. The man had an impressive pedigree: MBA from Wharton, 20 years at Morgan Stanley, then his own boutique wealth management firm, catering to high-net-worth clients. There was nothing in his background that raised red flags, which paradoxically made Jackson more suspicious. Sunday evening found him sitting at his laptop, nursing a glass of bourbon while scanning through old society pages from the Crimson Valley Gazette's digital archives. He was looking for any connection between Calloway and the Harringtons that predated Edmund's death. After 3 hours of searching, he found it. A grainy photo from a charity gala 15 years ago. Edmund Harrington in a tuxedo, Josephine on his arm in an elegant gown, and beside them a younger Robert Calloway, his arm around a blonde woman identified in the caption as Robert Calloway and wife Gloria. So they've known each other for years, Jackson muttered to himself, saving the image. It wasn't necessarily suspicious. Wealthy people tended to move in the same circles, but it did suggest a deeper connection than Josephine had implied. He searched further and found more photographs from various social events over the years. In most, Robert appeared with his wife, but in 2 from about 7 years ago, he was pictured with just Josephine. Edmund noticeably absent. The captions mentioned Edmund being abroad on business. Jackson rubbed his eyes and closed the laptop. He needed to adjust his approach. If Calloway and Josephine had a long-standing relationship, he would have to find a way to either win over the financial manager or work around him. Either way, tomorrow's lunch would be crucial. Morning birds chirping, sound of car engines starting. Monday morning dawned clear and bright. Jackson dressed carefully in what he thought of as his casual wealth attire: tailored chinos, a light blue button-down shirt under a navy blazer, and loafers without socks. The look suggested old money at leisure, the kind of effortless style that came from generations of privilege. As he drove toward Maple Hill, he rehearsed his adjusted strategy. Today, he would focus on building personal connection with Josephine rather than discussing finances. He needed her to see him not just as a potential advisor, but as someone she could trust on a deeper level. Someone she might confide in, perhaps even about her relationship with Calloway. Harrison greeted him at the door, as formal as before, but perhaps slightly less frosty. "Mrs. Harrington is in the garden pavilion. If you'll follow me, please." They walked through the grand house and out onto a stone terrace that overlooked what could only be described as a private park. Stone pathways wound through perfectly maintained flower beds, a small orchard, and several ornamental ponds. In the distance, a white pavilion stood on a gentle rise, surrounded by climbing roses. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Josephine's voice came from behind him. She wore gardening gloves and carried a basket of freshly cut flowers. Edmund designed it himself. He always said a man who couldn't appreciate beauty had no business with wealth. Jackson turned, offering his most genuine smile. "It's magnificent. You must find great peace here." "I do," she agreed, removing her gloves. "Harrison, would you please take these to Mrs. Patterson for arranging, and let Chef Thomas know we'll be ready for lunch in about an hour." As Harrison departed with the flowers, Josephine gestured toward the gardens. "Shall we walk? The roses are particularly lovely this time of year." They strolled along the stone paths, Josephine pointing out rare plant specimens and sharing stories about how Edmund had sourced them from around the world. Jackson listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions and sharing a fabricated anecdote about his grandmother's beloved garden in Connecticut. "And what about your parents?" Josephine asked, as they paused by a small reflecting pool where water lilies floated serenely. "You've mentioned your grandmother, but not them." Jackson had his backstory prepared. "They died when I was in college. Car accident. He gazed at the water, adopting the look of old grief carefully managed. My father was in finance too, taught me everything I know about the business. He always said that managing money was really about managing people's dreams. Josephine studied him thoughtfully. That's quite profound, and very true. She gestured toward a nearby bench. Let's sit for a moment. These old legs need occasional rest. As they settled on the stone bench, Jackson carefully steered the conversation toward her late husband. You and Edmund seem to have had a wonderful life together. 50 years, she nodded, a genuine softness coming to her features. Not all of it easy, mind you. Building his company nearly broke us twice, but we weathered it together. She paused, looking out over her gardens. The last few years were the happiest. After he sold the company, we traveled, spent time with friends, enjoyed the fruits of our labor. I'm sorry for your loss, Jackson said quietly, and was surprised to find he meant it. Something about her dignity and grief touched even his cynical heart. Thank you, she replied simply. After a moment she added, that's partly why I wanted to speak with you about my investments. Edmund provided well for me, but lately I've been thinking about what comes after. After? Jackson questioned. After I'm gone, she clarified. I have no children, as you know, but there are causes I care about. People who have been loyal. A shadow passed over her face, and those who haven't. Jackson sensed an opening. It sounds like you're considering some changes to your estate planning. Perhaps. She rose from the bench. But first, lunch. I find financial discussions go better with good food. As stable as anything can be in today's market, Jackson replied smoothly. The key is knowing when to move in and when to pull back. That's where my expertise comes in. Josephine considered this, sipping her tea thoughtfully. Robert has served me well, but he can be traditional in his thinking. She set down her cup decisively. I'd like you to prepare a more detailed proposal, something specific to my portfolio. Could you do that? Jackson worked to contain his excitement. This was exactly the opening he needed. Absolutely. I'd need to review your complete financial records, of course. Of course, she agreed. I'll have Harrison provide you with copies of everything. When could you have something for me to review? Give me a week, Jackson replied confidently. I'll put together a comprehensive plan. As lunch concluded, they walked back toward the main house. At the terrace, Josephine paused. I'm having a small dinner party this Saturday. Nothing formal, just a few old friends. I'd like you to join us. I'd be honored, Jackson replied, genuinely pleased at this unexpected invitation. Good. 7 o'clock. She smiled. Harrison will see you out. And Jackson? She touched his arm, lightly. Thank you for the lovely conversation. It's refreshing to speak with someone who understands both finance and life. As Jackson drove away from Maple Hill, he felt more confident than he had after Friday's dinner. Josephine was warming to him, creating distance between herself and Calloway. The financial records would give him everything he needed to craft not just a proposal, but the perfect con, one tailored precisely to her assets and vulnerabilities. By that evening, a courier had delivered a sealed envelope to his apartment containing detailed statements of Josephine's considerable holdings. Jackson spread them across his dining table, whistling softly. Even more impressive than he'd thought, nearly $12 million in liquid assets, property holdings in 3 states, and an art collection conservatively valued at $3 million as he began. Drafting his proposal, Jackson calculated that with careful maneuvering, he could siphon off at least $4 million before anyone noticed. More than enough to disappear to his prepared haven in the Cayman Islands. What Jackson didn't see was the thin, almost invisible thread that ran along the seal of the envelope he'd opened, nor did he notice the microscopic tracking device embedded. In the corner of each financial statement, technology developed by Edmund Harrington's company years ago for government security contracts. In a sleek, modern home across town, Robert Calloway sat at a bank of monitors, watching a small blinking, a dot that represented Jackson's movements. Beside him stood Harrison, no longer in his butler's uniform, but dressed in black tactical clothing that highlighted his military bearing. He took the bait, Robert noted, tapping one screen where thermal imaging showed Jackson hunched over papers. At his table, right on schedule, Harrison agreed, his voice no longer carrying any trace of civility. "Should I alert Mrs. Harrington?" Robert checked his watch. "No need. She's meeting with the DA now. Everything's proceeding exactly as planned." He zoomed in on one of the monitors, focusing on Jackson's intent face. "Our Mr. Reed has no idea what's coming." In yet another part of town, in a discreet office with no nameplate on the door, Josephine Harrington sat across from District Attorney Maxwell Thompson, her posture perfect, her expression grave. "You understand what you're proposing is risky," Thompson said, reviewing the documents before him, "and technically unorthodox." "I understand perfectly," Josephine replied, her voice firm, "but so is he. And if we want justice, not just for me, but for all the others, this is the only way." The DA sighed, then nodded slowly. "Very well, Mrs. Harrington, we'll proceed as discussed, but I want it on record that I have reservations." "Duly noted," she said, rising to leave. "And Warren, thank you. Edmund would have appreciated your help." As she stepped outside into the evening air, Josephine allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The pieces were falling into place. Now they just needed their charming conman to make his move. Saturday evening arrived with a perfect sunset painting Crimson Valley in hues of gold and amber. Jackson adjusted his tie in the mirror of his BMW before stepping out onto the circular driveway of Maple Hill Manor. He had gone all out for tonight's dinner party, his best suit, purchased with the proceeds of his last con in Seattle. Genuine, Italian leather shoes and a vintage Rolex he'd borrowed from a mark in Chicago and never returned. The investment proposal tucked into his leather portfolio was a masterpiece of deception, detailed enough to impress, vague enough to allow, flexibility, and structured to give him access to Josephine's accounts in incremental stages that wouldn't raise suspicion. He'd spent 3 days crafting it, anticipating every question Robert Calloway might raise. As Harrison opened the door, Jackson noticed something different about the house. The formal grandeur remained, but there was a festive energy. Fresh. Flowers in crystal vases, candles flickering in silver holders, and the sounds of conversation and laughter drifting from deeper within. "Good evening, Mr. Reed." Harrison greeted him with a slight bow. "Mrs. Harrington is with her guests in the garden room. If you'll follow me." Jackson followed the butler through the mansion, rehearsing the names he'd researched, the local judge and his wife, the hospital administrator, the bank president, all people who could be useful connections if his plan. With Josephine hit any snags, he'd prepared conversation topics for each of them. The garden room turned out to be a magnificent conservatory at the rear of the house. A soaring cathedral of glass and wrought iron filled with exotic plants and comfortable seating arrangements. About a dozen people stood in small clusters, holding cocktails and engaged in animated conversation. Josephine spotted him immediately and glided over, looking elegant in a silver-grey dress that complemented her hair. "Jackson, welcome. I'm so glad you could join us." She took his arm with surprising familiarity. "Come, let me introduce you to some friends." For the next half hour, Josephine led him through the gathering, making introductions. Jackson turned on his considerable charm, making each person feel like the most interesting individual in the room. He discussed local politics with Judge Whitman, hospital funding with Dr. Abrams, and community development with Evelyn Porter from the Historical Society. What struck him as odd was that Robert Calloway was nowhere to be seen. Even stranger, none of these people fit the profiles he'd expected. There was no bank president, no major business owners, just community figures and what appeared to be old friends of Josephine's. As cocktail hour wound down, Harrison appeared to announce that dinner was served. The guests moved to an adjoining room where a large round table was set with stunning china and crystal. Jackson found himself seated between Josephine and a striking woman in her 60s whom he hadn't yet met. "Jackson," Josephine said as they settled into their chairs, "this is Gloria Calloway, Robert's wife." Jackson's carefully maintained expression nearly slipped. "Mrs. Calloway, a pleasure," he managed smoothly, taking her extended hand. "I had the pleasure of meeting your husband last week." Gloria's smile was pleasant, but her eyes were sharp. "Yes, Robert mentioned you. Fascinating background you have, Mr. Reed." Before Jackson could respond, Josephine clinked her glass for attention. "Before we enjoy Chef Thomas's wonderful meal, I want to thank you all for coming tonight. As most of you know, these gatherings were Edmund's favorite tradition, and continuing them has been one of my greatest comforts." She paused, her gaze sweeping the table. "Tonight is special because we're celebrating a milestone. It's been exactly 15 years since Edmund and I established the Harrington Foundation." Murmurs of congratulations circled the table. "In honor of that anniversary," Josephine continued, "I've decided it's time to announce some changes to the Foundation's direction. But more on that after dinner. For now, let's enjoy each other's company." As the first course was served, a delicate crab bisque, Jackson's mind raced. Foundation changes could mean major financial restructuring, which could provide the perfect cover for his scheme. But something felt off about this gathering. These people seemed too familiar with each other, too comfortable in Josephine's home. "So, Mr. Reed," Gloria Calloway's voice interrupted his thoughts, "Robert tells me you're relatively new to Crimson Valley. What brought you to our little town?" Jackson launched into his practice story about seeking a quieter life after his divorce. But Gloria's questions became increasingly pointed, about specific Boston neighborhoods, financial firms he claimed to have worked with, even restaurants he should have known if he'd lived there as long as he claimed. "You'll have to forgive my curiosity," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Before I retired, I was a journalist. Old habits die hard." "No need to apologize," Jackson replied, matching her smile. "Curiosity is what keeps life interesting. Don't you think?" By the third course, a perfectly prepared beef Wellington, Jackson had managed to steer the conversation to safer topics, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Gloria Calloway was testing him. Even more disconcerting whenever. He glanced around the table. He caught at least one person studying him with unusual intensity. As dessert was served, Josephine rose again. "Now, as promised, I'd like to share my news about the Harrington Foundation." She lifted her wineglass. "For 15 years, we've focused primarily on educational initiatives and healthcare. Edmund believed, as do I, that these are the cornerstones of a thriving community." Murmurs of agreement circled the table. "But recently," she continued, "I've become aware of a growing problem that demands attention, one that affects many vulnerable people, particularly the elderly." Her gaze landed briefly on Jackson. "I'm speaking of financial exploitation." Jackson maintained his pleasant expression, but his pulse quickened. "That's why I've decided to establish a new branch of our foundation dedicated to identifying, exposing, and prosecuting those who prey on vulnerable individuals through investment scams and confidence schemes." Josephine's voice took on a steely quality. "We'll be working directly with the district attorney's office to create a specialized task force." Judge Whitman raised his glass. "An excellent initiative, Josephine. Long overdue." Jackson forced himself to nod in agreement, though alarm bells were ringing in his head. This couldn't be coincidence. Was his cover blown somehow? Had Calloway discovered something? In fact, Josephine continued, we already have our first case study, a sophisticated operation targeting wealthy widows across 3 states. The dinner guests leaned forward with interest. Jackson felt sweat forming on his brow. But more on that another time, Josephine concluded with a smile. Tonight is for celebration. Harrison, would you please bring in the champagne? As the butler appeared with a tray of champagne flutes, Josephine turned to Jackson. I hope you'll be part of this new initiative, Jackson. Your financial expertise would be invaluable in identifying how these scams work. I'd be honored, he replied automatically, mind whirling with possible escape strategies. Should he excuse himself now, make some emergency phone call and leave, or would that only confirm whatever suspicions she might have? The rest of the evening passed in a blur of conversation that Jackson navigated on autopilot, his charm masking the calculated risk assessment happening behind his smile. By the time guests began departing around 11, he had decided to proceed as planned, present his proposal, gain initial access to her accounts, and accelerate his timeline. If suspicions were brewing, he needed to move quickly. As the last guests left, Josephine invited him to join her for a nightcap in the library. The wood-paneled room with its leather-bound books and deep armchairs felt like a trap closing around him, but he accepted a glass of cognac with a steady hand. I hope you enjoyed the evening, Josephine said, settling into a chair opposite him. Very much, Jackson replied. You have fascinating friends. They're more like family, really, she said, studying him over her glass. Edmund and I never had children, so we created our family from the people we trusted most. She paused. Trust is such a rare commodity, don't you think? Increasingly so, Jackson agreed cautiously. That's why, when I find someone I believe I can trust, I hold on to them. Her blue eyes fixed on him intently. I think you might be such a person, Jackson. This was not at all what he had expected after the dinner conversation. I'm flattered, he said carefully. I'd like to move forward with your investment proposal, she continued. In fact, I'm prepared to transfer an initial sum, say $1 million, to your management by the end of next week. Jackson nearly choked on his cognac. That's very decisive of you. At my age, one doesn't have time to waste, Josephine replied with a small smile. Besides, I've always trusted my instincts about people, and my instincts about you are quite clear. Warning bells clanged louder in Jackson's mind, but the prospect of such quick access to her funds was too tempting to ignore. This could accelerate his timeline dramatically, get in, transfer funds, and disappear before whatever suspicions existed could crystallize into action. I'm honored by your confidence, he said, setting down his glass. I promise you won't be disappointed. I'm certain I won't, she replied, her smile enigmatic. Harrison will show you out, and Jackson, I look forward to our partnership. As he drove away from Maple Hill Manor, Jackson's mind raced through scenarios and contingencies. Something wasn't right. The dinner party, the foundation announcement, Gloria Calloway's interrogation. It all suggested he was being watched, possibly even set up. Yet Josephine was offering him exactly what he wanted, and faster than he had dared hope. He pulled over at a scenic overlook above Crimson Valley, the town lights twinkling below like fallen stars. The smart play would be to cut his losses and disappear tonight, but $1 million, possibly more, was within his grasp. And if there was one thing Jackson Reed couldn't resist, it was the perfect score. He made his decision. He would proceed, but with extreme caution. Double-check every step, prepare an emergency exit strategy, and move faster than anyone could anticipate. If Josephine Harrington thought she was setting a trap, she'd soon discover that he was no easy prey. What Jackson couldn't see from his vantage point was the black sedan parked a discreet distance behind him, or the telephoto lens capturing his every move as he sat contemplating in his car, nor could he hear the conversation between the car's occupants, Harrison and a woman whose face remained in shadow. "He's staying," Harrison observed, lowering his night vision binoculars. "Just as you predicted." "Of course he is," the woman replied. "Men like him always believe they're the smartest person in the room." She checked her watch. "Tell Josephine we're proceeding to Phase 2. It's time to give Mr. Reed exactly what he wants." Jackson hunched over his laptop in the back corner of the Grindstone Cafe, 3 empty espresso cups littering the table beside stacks of financial documents. It was Tuesday morning, 3 days after Josephine's dinner party, and he had barely slept since then. The screen before him displayed a complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts he'd spent years establishing. His escape route when the time came. His finger hovered over the keyboard as he contemplated entering Josephine's account information into the transfer protocols. Everything was ready. Tomorrow, she would sign the authorization forms, giving him trading authority over her accounts. By Friday, he could begin moving the first small transfers. Nothing suspicious, just enough to test the waters. Yet something held him back. The nagging feeling that he was missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. It wasn't just the dinner party or Gloria Calloway's probing questions. Something about the whole situation felt orchestrated, as if he were being led down a path of someone else's design. "More coffee, Mr. Reed?" Sarah, the young barista, appeared at his elbow with a fresh pot. Jackson quickly minimized his screen. "Thank you, Sarah." He pushed one of the empty cups toward her. As she poured, she hesitated. I hope you don't mind me asking, but are you okay? You look like you haven't slept." Jackson forced a smile. "Just working on an important project. Deadlines, you know." "Must be important." She nodded toward the documents. "I've never seen anyone study bank statements that intensely before." Jackson's instincts flared. He'd been careful to keep the papers angled away from passers-by. "Just part of the job," he replied casually, gathering the documents into a neat stack and sliding them into his portfolio. "Financial planning can be tedious, but necessary work." Sarah smiled. "Well, don't work too hard. Oh, before I forget, woman came in looking for you yesterday. Older lady, very elegant. Asked if you were a regular here." Jackson's pulse quickened. "Did she leave a name?" "No, just said she was an old friend from Boston." Sarah tilted her head curiously. "She had the most amazing emerald ring, looked antique, with little diamonds around it. Thank you for letting me know," Jackson said, his mind racing. The description didn't match Josephine or Gloria Calloway. Who else was looking for him? After Sarah moved on to other customers, Jackson packed up quickly. He'd been using the cafe as his unofficial office for weeks, a habit that now seemed careless. If someone was tracking his movements, he needed to be more unpredictable. Outside, he scanned the street carefully before walking to his car. Crimson Valley's main thoroughfare was quiet for a Tuesday morning. A few shoppers, a mail carrier, nothing obviously suspicious. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Instead of driving straight to his apartment, Jackson took a meandering route, doubling back several times and even parking briefly at the local supermarket before continuing home. Only when he was certain he wasn't being followed did he finally return to his apartment. The moment he stepped inside, he knew something was wrong. Nothing was visibly disturbed, but the air felt different, disturbed in a way that only someone who lived alone would notice. Moving silently, he checked each room, finding nothing out of place until he reached his bedroom. There, centered on his pillow, lay a single playing card, the Queen of Spades. Jackson stared at it, ice forming in his veins. It was a message, one he understood all too well. In con artist circles, the Queen of Spades was known as the Black Lady, a warning that you were being targeted, either by law enforcement or by another player in the game. He snatched up the card, flipping it over. On the back, written in elegant script, was a message. "Check your email, Mr. Chambers." Chambers, a name he hadn't used in 5 years, since a job in Miami that had gone badly wrong. Whoever had left this knew his real identity. With shaking hands, Jackson opened his laptop and accessed a secure email account he kept for emergencies. There was a single new message from an anonymous sender. The subject line read simply, "Options." The email contained only 2 paragraphs. "Mr. Chambers, or Reed if you prefer, your current endeavor in Crimson Valley has attracted unwanted attention. Mrs. Harrington is not what she appears to be, but then neither are you. You have been playing a game whose rules you do not understand against opponents you have not identified. You have 2 choices. Walk away now and avoid federal prosecution, or meet me tomorrow at noon at the Riverside Cemetery, Section E. Come alone. This offer expires in 24 hours. There was no signature. Jackson sank onto the edge of his bed, his mind working furiously. Someone knew everything, his real identity, his plan for Josephine, possibly even his criminal history. But who? Robert Calloway was the obvious suspect. But this didn't feel like his style. The dinner party guests? Unlikely. Law enforcement? Possibly. But they wouldn't typically offer a meeting before making an arrest. He paced the apartment, weighing his options. Walking away meant losing the biggest score of his career, but meeting this mysterious messenger could be walking into a trap. In the end, curiosity won out. If someone had gone to these lengths to contact him, they wanted something. Information, perhaps, or cooperation. Either way, knowing was better than running blind. Sounds of wind through trees, distant bird calls. Riverside Cemetery sprawled along the eastern edge of Crimson Valley, its rolling hills dotted with monuments and mausoleums. Dating back to the town's founding, Section E was one of the oldest areas, filled with weathered headstones and ancient oak trees that cast dappled shadows across the grass. Jackson arrived 20 minutes early, parking his car at the main entrance and walking the winding path to Section E. He'd chosen his clothing carefully, casual enough not to attract attention, but with running shoes in case a quick escape became necessary. In his jacket pocket, he carried a small canister of pepper spray and his car keys positioned between his fingers as an improvised weapon. He circled the section twice, checking for anyone hiding among the graves, before positioning himself with his back to a large oak tree that gave him a clear view of all approaching paths. At precisely noon, he spotted a figure walking toward him, a woman, middle-aged, dressed in a simple grey pantsuit. She moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to authority. As she drew closer, Jackson felt a jolt of recognition. "Agent Brennan," he said as she stopped a few feet away. "It's been what? 5 years. Special Agent Melissa Brennan, of the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, smiled thinly. "Good memory, Chambers. Most people I bust try to forget my face." "Hard to forget the woman who nearly put me away for 20 years, Jackson replied, keeping his tone light, despite the tension coiling in his stomach. "Though, as I recall, your case fell apart rather spectacularly." "Lack of evidence isn't the same as innocence," she countered. "But that's ancient history. I'm here about your current project." Jackson maintained his poker face. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm a financial advisor now, completely legitimate." Brennan laughed, the sound sharp in the cemetery. "Quiet. Save it. We both know why you're in Crimson Valley, and it's not to help little old ladies with their 401ks. She withdrew a small device from her pocket, a tablet that she handed to him. On the screen was a series of photographs. Jackson meeting with Josephine at the bakery, entering Maple Hill Manor, even sitting in his apartment reviewing her financial documents. "We've been watching you since Milwaukee," Brennan said as he flipped through the images. "The Winters case, that poor man lost his entire retirement fund. "You can't prove that was me," Jackson replied automatically, though his confidence was rapidly eroding. "Maybe not then, but now?" Brennan gestured. "To the tablet. We have enough to put you away for a very long time." Jackson handed the tablet back, mind racing through possible angles. "So why the cloak and dagger routine? Why not just arrest me?" "Because I'm offering you a deal." Brennan's expression turned serious. "Josephine Harrington isn't just any mark. Chambers, she's part of something bigger, something that's been on our radar for a long time." Jackson frowned. "What are you talking about?" "She's a wealthy widow. She's the key witness in a case we've been building for 3 years against the Westmore Financial Group," Brennan explained. "They've been running an elaborate Ponzi scheme targeting elderly investors. Edmund Harrington discovered it shortly before his death and began gathering evidence. After he died, Josephine continued his work. Pieces began falling into place in Jackson's mind. The Foundation announcement about elder fraud, Robert Calloway's intense scrutiny, even Harrison's military bearing that had seemed out of place for a butler. "So she's working with the FBI," he said slowly, "and I walked right into the middle of your operation." "Not exactly," Brennan sighed. "We've been monitoring Josephine's activities, but she doesn't know it. She and Robert Calloway have been conducting their own parallel investigation. Less legally than we'd prefer." "And where do I fit in?" Jackson asked, though he was beginning to see the outline of something he didn't like. "You're a complication," Brennan admitted. "Josephine spotted you for what you are immediately. She's sharper than most people realize. But instead of reporting you, she decided to use you as a test case for her new hobby." "Hobby?" "Catching con artists," Brennan said bluntly. "After what happened with Westmore, she's made it her mission. You're not the first she's lured in and exposed." The implications hit Jackson like a physical blow. He hadn't been hunting Josephine, she had been hunting him. Every interaction, every seemingly coincidental meeting, had been orchestrated to draw him deeper into her web. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice steadier than he felt. "That depends on you," Brennan replied. "Option 1, you walk away from Crimson Valley today. No charges filed for what you've attempted with Josephine, but you're on our radar permanently. One wrong move anywhere, anytime, we take you down. And option 2, you help us," Brennan said simply. "Josephine's methods are effective but extra-legal. She's gathering evidence against Westmore that we can't use in court because of how she's obtaining it. But you—" She paused meaningfully. "You could get inside Westmore legitimately as part of a plea deal. Wear a wire, gather admissible evidence." Jackson laughed bitterly. "You want me to con the con men? Become an informant?" "I prefer confidential human source." "But essentially, yes." Brennan's expression was deadly serious. "This is a one-time offer, Chambers. Help us take down Westmore and your slate gets wiped clean. All previous investigations closed, a fresh start." "And if I refuse?" "Then I arrest you right now," she replied calmly. "The U.S. attorney has already prepared charges: wire fraud, identity theft, conspiracy. The minimum sentence is 15 years. Jackson looked out over the peaceful cemetery, weighing his options. Walking away meant losing the score, but keeping his freedom temporarily. Becoming an informant was risky, potentially fatal, if Westmore discovered his true purpose. Being arrested meant the end of his career, and possibly the rest of his life behind bars. "What about Josephine?" he asked finally. "What happens with her?" "That's not your concern," Brennan said. "But if it helps you decide, know that she's not your enemy. She's just a woman who got tired of seeing predators walk away unpunished." Jackson nodded slowly, a strange respect blooming for the elderly widow who had so thoroughly outplayed him. "I need time to think." "You have until 6 p.m. Brennan handed him a burner phone. My number is the only one programmed in it. Call me with your decision." As she walked away, Jackson remained by the oak tree, the weight of his choices pressing down on him like the stone angels watching silently from nearby graves. For the first time in his career, he wasn't the one setting the trap. He was the one caught in it. A thunderstorm rolled over Crimson Valley as evening approached, matching Jackson's turbulent thoughts. He sat in his apartment, the burner phone from Agent Brennan on the coffee table before him, the deadline for his decision approaching with each tick of the clock. His laptop was open to flight schedules, a quick escape to Atlanta, then international. Connections to places without extradition treaties. He had emergency funds, fake passports, everything needed to disappear. It was the safest play, the one most consistent with his survival instincts. Yet something kept him from booking the ticket. Moving to the window, Jackson watched rain streak down the glass as lightning illuminated the town below. 5 years ago in Miami, when Agent Brennan had nearly caught him, he'd run without hesitation. The choice had been simple then. Why was he hesitating now? His gaze fell on Josephine's financial documents spread across his desk. The elderly widow had outmaneuvered him completely, recognized him for what he was from the beginning, and turned his own game against him. Instead of seeing her as a vulnerable mark, she had identified him as a predator and set a trap of her own. There was something almost admirable about it. The clock on his wall showed 5:30 p.m., 30 minutes to make a decision that would determine the rest of his life. He picked up the burner phone, then set it down again. There was something missing, some piece of information he needed before he could decide. He needed to understand Josephine's angle completely. Making a sudden decision, Jackson grabbed his keys and rain jacket. He would go directly to the source. Sound of car in rain, windshield wipers. Maple Hill Manor stood dark against the stormy sky as Jackson's car approached, only a few windows glowing with warm light. The rain had intensified, forming small rivers. Along the driveway as he pulled up to the imposing entrance, Harrison answered his knock, displaying no surprise at Jackson's unannounced appearance, soaked from the brief dash from car to door. "Mr. Reed, this is unexpected." The butler's voice was neutral, betraying nothing. "I need to speak with Mrs. Harrington," Jackson said, rainwater dripping onto the marble floor. "It's urgent." Harrison studied him for a moment. "Wait here, please." Left alone in the entrance hall, Jackson took in details he had missed before. The subtle security cameras disguised as decorative elements, the reinforced hinges on the ornate doors, the panic button discreetly installed beside an antique side table. This wasn't just a wealthy widow's home. It was a fortress disguised as a mansion. Harrison returned moments later. "Mrs. Harrington will see you in the library. May I take your wet coat?" Jackson surrendered his jacket and followed the butler, through now familiar halls to the wood-paneled sanctuary where he'd had cognac with Josephine just days earlier. This time, she was not alone. Robert Calloway stood by the fireplace, his expression guarded. "Jackson," Josephine greeted him from her armchair, calm and collected as always. "This is a surprise. I wasn't expecting you until our meeting tomorrow." "Plans change," Jackson replied, remaining standing despite her gesture toward a chair, "especially when the FBI gets involved." A flicker of something, concern, amusement, crossed Josephine's face. "I see. You've spoken with Agent Brennan." "I knew," Jackson stated flatly. "You knew she was watching me, watching us." "Of course I knew," Josephine's voice was matter of fact. "Melissa Brennan is very good at her job, but subtlety isn't her strong suit. 2 of her agents have been staying at the Crimson Valley Inn for 3 weeks. They stand out in a town this small." Robert moved closer to Josephine, his protective stance unmistakable. "What did Brennan offer you?" "A deal," Jackson answered bluntly. "Help them build a case against Westmore Financial and my slate gets wiped clean, or I can walk away, always looking over my shoulder. Or option 3, Arrest and prosecution. Josephine nodded thoughtfully. What have you decided? I haven't, Jackson admitted. Not until I understand what's really happening here. Brennan says you're investigating Westmore on your own. Why? What's your stake in this? A heavy silence fell, broken only by rain lashing the windows and thunder, rumbling in the distance. Josephine and Robert exchanged a look, some unspoken communication passing between them. Finally, Josephine sighed. Harrison, would you bring us some tea? I believe this conversation may take some time. After the butler departed, Josephine rose and moved to a painting on the far wall, a portrait of her late husband. She swung it aside to reveal a wall safe, which she opened with practiced movements. From within, she withdrew a thick folder. Edmund didn't die of natural causes, she said quietly, returning to her seat. The official record says heart failure, but that's not the whole truth. Jackson remained silent, sensing that interrupting would only delay the explanation he sought. 3 years ago, Josephine continued, Edmund discovered irregularities in several investment funds managed by Westmore Financial, funds that many of our friends and business associates had placed their life savings into, based on Edmund's recommendation. Her voice tightened. He began investigating quietly, gathering evidence. What he found was a massive Ponzi scheme targeting elderly investors across 5 states. Robert picked up the narrative. I was working with him. We were building a case to take to the SEC and FBI, but 2 weeks before we were ready, Edmund received a threatening phone call. Someone knew what he was doing. Edmund insisted on continuing. Josephine's eyes grew distant with memory. He said he couldn't live with himself if he allowed others to be defrauded when he could stop it. 3 days later, he died suddenly at his desk. Heart attack? Jackson asked, though he already knew the answer. The autopsy showed digitalis in his system, Robert said grimly. A heart medication Edmund wasn't prescribed. In high doses, it mimics natural heart failure. The medical examiner ruled it inconclusive. Not enough evidence for murder charges, but enough for suspicion. Why didn't you go to the police? Jackson asked. We did, Josephine replied sharply, but without concrete evidence connecting Westmore. To the digitalis, there was nothing they could do. The FBI opened an investigation into the Ponzi scheme, but Westmore's people are careful. 2 years later, they still haven't gathered enough admissible evidence for an indictment. Jackson nodded slowly, pieces falling into place. So you decided to take matters into your own hands? Not initially, Josephine admitted. At first, I simply continued Edmund's work, gathering documents, recording conversations when possible. But Westmore's security tightened. We couldn't get close anymore. Until we realized there was another approach, Robert added. Westmore doesn't just target the elderly. They recruit con men to help identify and groom potential victims. Jackson's blood ran cold as the full picture emerged. You're setting me up to be recruited by Westmore. Not exactly. Josephine's expression was almost apologetic. We're offering you a choice, the same one Agent Brennan presented, but with additional context. You see, Brennan doesn't know everything. She knows about Westmore's Ponzi scheme, but not about Edmund's murder. That evidence is still circumstantial, but if someone were to infiltrate Westmore from within, Robert said meaningfully, they might find more concrete connections. And that someone would be me, Jackson concluded. Working for you, not just the FBI. Josephine nodded. The FBI wants financial crimes evidence. We want justice for Edmund. Harrison returned with a tea tray, serving each person before withdrawing silently. The fragrant steam rose between them as Jackson considered the implications of what he'd learned. Why me, he asked finally. Why not hire a private investigator or work through proper channels? Because Westmore would spot a PI or an undercover agent a mile away, Robert explained. They're paranoid and thorough. But you, he gestured toward Jackson, you're the real thing. A genuine con man with a documented history of successful scams. Your background checks out completely, Josephine added, "even down to your preferences for targeting wealthy widows. You're exactly the type Westmore recruits." Jackson sipped his tea, buying time to process this unexpected turn. "So you identified me as a con man, pretended to be my mark, all to set me up for this larger game against Westmore?" "Yes," Josephine admitted without apology. "When we learned you had arrived in Crimson Valley, we saw an opportunity. I became the bait, and you took it exactly as we predicted. And the FBI surveillance, the Foundation announcement about elder fraud, that was all part of the setup?" "The FBI has been watching independently," Robert clarified. "The Foundation announcement was partly theater for your benefit, but also genuine. Josephine has indeed established that initiative, with the ulterior motive of creating a legitimate reason for gathering information about financial predators," Jackson noted. Josephine smiled slightly. "Every good con has layers of truth within it. You should appreciate that, Mr. Chambers." Hearing his real name again sent a chill through Jackson. "What happens if I agree to help you? How would this work?" "If you accept Brennan's offer, you'll be working officially as an FBI informant," Robert explained. "That gives you legitimacy and protection, but you'll also feed information to us about anything related to Edmund's death, information that might not interest the FBI but matters to our investigation." "Double agent," Jackson mused. "Risky. Less risky than federal prison," Josephine pointed out, "and potentially more rewarding than simply running. The FBI can clear your record, but they can't offer financial compensation. We can." A flash of lightning illuminated the library, followed by a crash of thunder that seemed to underscore the gravity of the moment. "How much?" Jackson asked, the question automatic rather than motivated by genuine interest. Strangely, the money seemed almost secondary now. $1 million, Josephine stated. "Half now, half upon completion, regardless of the outcome with the FBI, so long as you fulfill your part of our arrangement." Jackson paced the room, weighing his options. It was an elaborate scheme with multiple failure points. If Westmore discovered his true purpose, his life would be worth nothing. If the FBI discovered he was working for Josephine independently, his deal could be revoked. If Josephine and Robert were manipulating him for some other purpose entirely. Yet, there was something compelling about their quest for justice, something that resonated with a part of Jackson he had long ignored. The burner phone in his pocket showed 5:55 p.m., 5 minutes to deadline. "I need your answer now, Jackson," Josephine said quietly. "Agent Brennan isn't known for her patience." Jackson looked at the elderly widow who had so thoroughly outmaneuvered him, seeing behind her fragile appearance to the steel beneath. Then he made his choice. "I'll need details about Westmore, everything you have, and I want the payment in an escrow account, released only if I survive this." Josephine's face relaxed into a genuine smile. "I believe we can arrange that." Jackson pulled out the burner phone and dialed the only number programmed into it. When Agent Brennan answered, his response was simple. "I'm in. But we do this my way." What no one in the room realized was that Jackson had made not one decision that evening, but two. The first was to agree to the FBI's offer and Josephine's proposal. The second, kept private in the recesses of his mind, was that once inside Westmore Financial, he would play this game according to his own rules, with an endgame that neither Brennan nor Josephine had anticipated. 2 weeks after his fateful decision in Josephine's library, Jackson Chambers, now using his real name professionally for the first time in years, stood in the gleaming lobby of the Westmore Financial Group's headquarters in Boston. The 60-story glass and steel tower dominated the financial district, its sleek design projecting an aura of success and stability that, according to Josephine's files, was entirely illusory. Jackson straightened his Italian silk tie, purchased, with the first installment of Josephine's payment, and checked his reflection in the polished marble wall. His tailored suit, designer watch, genuine this time, and newly styled haircut completed the image of a successful financial advisor with a flexible moral compass. "Mr. Chambers?" A young woman in a crisp navy suit approached him. "I'm Vanessa Moore, Mr. Westmore's executive assistant. He's ready to see you now." Jackson followed her to a private elevator that required a key card for access. As they ascended to the top floor, he mentally reviewed the cover story that Agent Brennan and Josephine had carefully constructed together during a tense strategy session at a safe house outside Crimson Valley. According to his new background, Jackson Chambers was a financial advisor who specialized in wealth liberation from vulnerable elderly clients, a euphemism for the exact type of scheme he had attempted with Josephine. His fabricated track record included successful cons in Seattle, Milwaukee, and Phoenix, carefully selected to match cases that the FBI knew about but couldn't prove. Just enough truth to be verifiable if Westmore checked. The elevator opened directly into a reception area where another assistant sat guarding the entrance to Calvin Westmore's inner sanctum. The walls were adorned with trophy photographs of Westmore with politicians, celebrities, and business leaders, all designed to impress and intimidate visitors. "Go right in," the receptionist nodded after a brief intercom exchange. "Mr. Westmore is expecting you." The corner office beyond was a temple to power and wealth, floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Boston Harbor, rare art pieces, displayed with museum-quality lighting and furnishings that probably cost more than most people's homes. At its center stood a massive desk of polished ebony, behind which sat Calvin Westmore himself. At 58, Westmore looked a decade younger, tan, fit, with carefully maintained silver hair and the confident posture of a man accustomed to getting his way. He rose as Jackson entered, his smile practiced and calculating. "Jackson Chambers," Westmore extended his hand. "Finally, we meet in person. Your reputation precedes you." Jackson shook the offered hand firmly. "Likewise, Mr. Westmore. Thank you for making time to see me." "Calvin, please. I think we're going to be good friends." Westmore gestured to a seating area near the windows. "Scotch? I have an excellent 30-year Macallan." "I never turn down good Scotch," Jackson replied with a smile. As Westmore poured amber, liquid into crystal tumblers, Jackson subtly touched his left cufflink, activating the sophisticated recording device that FBI technicians had disguised as an ordinary accessory. Everything said in this room would be transmitted to a surveillance team parked 3 blocks away. "So," Westmore handed Jackson a glass before settling into a leather chair opposite him. "Richard Keller speaks very highly of you, says you have a particular talent for gaining the confidence of wealthy widows." Richard Keller, one of Westmore's recruiters who had approached Jackson after receiving a carefully orchestrated tip about his skills from an FBI cutout. "It's a specialized field," Jackson replied modestly. "Requires patience and a certain psychological insight." "Indeed." Westmore sipped his scotch. "Richard mentioned your work in Milwaukee was particularly impressive." "The Winters case?" Jackson nodded, hiding his surprise that Westmore knew specific details. "Mrs. Winters was uniquely vulnerable. Recently widowed, isolated from family, substantial assets in negotiable securities, the perfect scenario. Until her son hired a forensic accountant," Westmore observed with a knowing smile. "A miscalculation on my part," Jackson admitted, sticking to the script prepared for him. "I underestimated the son's suspicious nature. Fortunately, I maintain careful operational security. Nothing directly traceable." Westmore studied him over the rim of his glass. "Yet you had to abandon the operation and relocate, a significant lost opportunity, which is partly why I'm here." Jackson leaned forward slightly. "Individual operations have their place, but the risk-reward ratio is problematic. I believe there are more efficient approaches with better protection against individual exposure, such A systematic approach, institutional backing, proper legal infrastructure to shield the principals. Jackson took a calculated risk. I believe that's what Westmore Financial offers its special advisors, isn't it? Westmore's eyes narrowed slightly. Richard has been indiscreet. Not at all, Jackson countered smoothly. He was appropriately vague. But I can read between the lines. You've built something sophisticated here, a system for identifying and monetizing vulnerable assets without the typical risks of individual operations. I want in. A long silence followed as Westmore assessed him. Jackson maintained steady eye contact, projecting confidence while his heart hammered in his chest. This was the crucial moment. Either Westmore would take the bait or sense deception. Finally, Westmore set down his glass. What makes you think you have something to offer an organization like ours? We don't lack for skilled operators. 3 things, Jackson replied without hesitation. First, my success rate, 83% conversion of targets to completed acquisitions. Second, my client selection methodology. I've developed specific algorithms for identifying optimal marks based on public records and financial disclosures. And third, he paused for effect, I have a potential whale on the line right now that could be the largest single acquisition of my career. Westmore's interest visibly sharpened. Go on. Josephine Harrington, Jackson said, playing his prepared card. Widow of Edmund Harrington, the manufacturing magnate, estate valued conservatively at $15 million, highly liquid assets, minimal family oversight. I've established initial contact and gained preliminary trust. With proper backing and infrastructure, I could secure full financial control within 45 days. The name triggered exactly the reaction Jackson had anticipated, a momentary flash of recognition and calculation in Westmore's eyes before his expression smoothed back to professional interest. Harrington, Westmore repeated thoughtfully. The name is familiar. Edmund Harrington's company was involved in defense manufacturing, if I recall correctly. Among other things, Jackson confirmed. He diversified extensively before selling to Syntec Industries 3 years ago. The widow received the bulk of the proceeds. She's lonely, isolated, and, most importantly, trusting. Westmore rose and moved to his desk, pressing an intercom button. Vanessa, please ask Marcus to join us immediately. He turned back to Jackson with a thin smile. I think it's time you met our Director of Special Acquisitions. 5 minutes later, a door at the side of the office opened to admit a stocky man with close-cropped grey hair and cold eyes. He moved with military precision, his expression giving away nothing as Westmore made introductions. Jackson Chambers, this is Marcus Devlin, our Director of Special Acquisitions. Marcus, Mr. Chambers is considering joining our team of specialized advisors. He has an interesting proposition involving the Harrington estate. Devlin's handshake was brief and assessing. Harrington, he repeated, his voice a gravelly rumble. Interesting coincidence. We had some dealings with Edmund Harrington before his unfortunate passing. Jackson noted the careful phrasing. Nothing that would complicate a new approach to the widow, I hope. That depends. Devlin exchanged a loaded glance with Westmore. What exactly do you know about Mrs. Harrington's current financial advisors? This was dangerous territory. Jackson recalled Josephine's briefing materials. Robert Calloway was publicly known to manage her affairs, but there had been no direct connection established between Calloway and Westmore's previous interest in the Harrington fortune. She works primarily with a local manager named Robert Calloway, Jackson replied, watching their reactions carefully. Small-time operator, conservative investment approach. He wouldn't be difficult to work around. Devlin's expression hardened slightly. Calloway and Harrington were close friends. He was also Edmund's advisor for years, which gives him a false sense of security. Jackson countered smoothly. The widow trusts me enough to have shared her complete financial records already. Calloway may suspect something, but he has no concrete evidence of my intentions. And more importantly, Josephine is beginning to see him as overly cautious, limiting her options. Westmore and Devlin exchanged another look, some unspoken communication passing between them. "Tell me, Mr. Chambers," Westmore said, returning to his seat. "What exactly do you know about Edmund Harrington's death?" The question carried weight beyond its simple wording. Jackson could feel both men watching him intently, measuring his response. This might be the real test, not just of his cover story, but of Josephine's theory about Westmore's involvement in her husband's death. "Heart failure, wasn't it?" Jackson replied with calculated casualness. "Natural causes, according to the widow. Why do you ask?" Devlin's posture relaxed fractionally. "Just curious. When approaching a widow, it's always useful to understand the circumstances that created the opportunity." "Of course," Jackson nodded, keeping his expression neutral while internally noting the evasive response. "My focus has been on Mrs. Harrington's current vulnerability, not her past loss." Westmore seemed satisfied with this answer. "Well, Mr. Chambers, your timing is fortunate. We've been considering expanding our special advisory team, and your experience aligns with our needs. However," he raised a cautionary finger, "we have a thorough vetting process. Trust is paramount in our organization." "I would expect nothing less," Jackson replied. "Marcus will handle your onboarding and evaluation," Westmore continued. "If things proceed satisfactorily, we can discuss the Harrington opportunity in more detail." Devlin stepped forward. "I'll need complete background information, verification of your previous operations, and detailed intelligence on your current positioning with Mrs. Harrington." "Of course," Jackson agreed. "When do we start?" "Immediately," Devlin said flatly. "My office is downstairs. We'll begin the verification process today." As Jackson followed Devlin out of Westmore's office, he could feel the weight of the executive's gaze on his back. The first hurdle had been cleared. He was inside Westmore Financial, but he sensed that the real tests were just beginning. What Jackson couldn't see was Westmore picking up a secure phone line the moment the door closed behind them. "It's me," Westmore said quietly. "Run a complete background check on Jackson Chambers, and I mean complete. Financials, contacts, every operation he's ever been involved with." "Something feels off." He paused, listening to the response. "Yes," he mentioned Harrington specifically. "Could be coincidence, could be something else. Either way, I want answers before we bring him any further inside." As Westmore hung up, his expression hardened from calculated charm to cold determination. Jackson Chambers might be exactly what he appeared to be, a talented conman seeking the protection of a larger operation. Or he might be something far more dangerous. Either way, Calvin Westmore hadn't built his empire by taking unnecessary risks. 1 month after Jackson's first meeting with Calvin Westmore, the grand ballroom of the Boston Heritage Hotel buzzed with activity. The annual Westmore Financial Charity Gala was in full swing, a glittering affair where Boston's elite mingled with politicians, celebrities, and the financial world's power players. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables adorned with extravagant floral arrangements, while a string quartet played softly in the background. Jackson adjusted his bow tie as he surveyed the room from a strategic position near the bar. His month inside Westmore Financial had been a dangerous dance, providing enough legitimate intelligence to the FBI to maintain his cover while feeding selected information back to Josephine, all while navigating Marcus Devlin's exhaustive vetting. In process, somehow, he had managed to survive it all. Tonight would determine whether it had been worth the risk. "Champagne, sir?" A server appeared at his elbow with a tray of flutes. "Thank you," Jackson replied, taking a glass while scanning the crowd. Calvin Westmore held court near the stage, surrounded by admiring donors. Marcus Devlin lurked at the periphery, his ever-watchful eyes continuously sweeping the room. And across the ballroom, making a perfectly timed entrance that drew all eyes to her, was Josephine Harrington. At 72, she commanded attention. In a midnight blue gown that spoke of old money and timeless elegance, her silver hair was arranged in a sophisticated updo, accented by sapphires that caught the light when she moved. Robert Calloway accompanied her, playing the role of devoted financial advisor with practiced ease. Jackson's earpiece crackled subtly. "All units in position," Agent Brennan's voice informed him. "Surveillance confirms 6 targets present. Warrant package is ready. We move on your signal." "Acknowledged," Jackson murmured into his champagne glass, the hidden microphone in his, cufflinks picking up his response. The plan had come together over weeks of careful preparation. Tonight's gala provided the perfect opportunity. All of Westmore's key conspirators gathered in one place, with electronic devices left in the courtroom due to the organization's paranoid security protocols. More importantly, Westmore's private office would be unoccupied, giving the FBI's technical team the access they needed to recover critical evidence. Jackson watched as Josephine made her way through the crowd, accepting greetings with gracious smiles. The whispers followed her. Who had invited Edmund Harrington's widow? Why would she attend an event hosted by Westmore Financial? Right on cue, Calvin Westmore broke away from his admirers and intercepted Josephine before she could progress further. "Into the ballroom, Mrs. Harrington," he greeted her with a politician's smile. "What an unexpected pleasure. I don't believe you were on our guest list." Josephine's smile was arctic. "Mr. Westmore, I received a special invitation. I believe you. Know my financial advisor, Robert Calloway?" Westmore barely acknowledged Robert with a curt nod. "Of course. Still, I'm surprised to see you here, given the history." "History is precisely why I came," Josephine replied, her voice carrying just enough to attract attention from nearby guests. "It's been 3 years since Edmund's death. Time for old questions to be answered, don't you think?" A shadow crossed Westmore's face. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately." "I think not," Josephine countered. "Privacy has served your purposes long enough, Calvin." Jackson moved closer, positioning himself within earshot, as curious onlookers began to notice the tension between the elderly widow and the powerful financier. "Mrs. Harrington," Westmore's voice dropped to a warning tone. "This is neither the time nor place for whatever you believe needs discussing. On the contrary," Josephine's voice strengthened, "this is exactly the right moment with so many witnesses present, including your friend Marcus Devlin, who I believe delivered the digitalis to my husband's office the day before he died." A collective gasp rippled through the nearby guests. Marcus Devlin froze across the room, his hand instinctively moving toward his jacket before stopping himself. Westmore's face hardened. "That's a serious and completely unfounded accusation, one that could have serious legal consequences for you." "Oh, I'm well aware of legal consequences," Josephine replied calmly, "which is why I've ensured the evidence is already in the proper hands." Jackson touched his earpiece. "Execute now," he murmured, giving the signal the FBI team was waiting. For what evidence?" Westmore demanded, his composure cracking. "There is no evidence because there was no crime." Josephine's smile was triumphant. "Edmund kept meticulous records, Calvin, including recordings of your threats when he discovered your Ponzi scheme. He may not have lived to testify, but his evidence survived." At that moment, the ballroom doors opened to admit a stream of FBI agents in tactical gear, led by Agent Brennan. Simultaneously, Marcus Devlin made a move toward a side exit, only to find it blocked by more agents. "Calvin Westmore," Brennan announced, approaching with her badge displayed. "You're under arrest for securities fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, and accessory to murder." Chaos erupted as guests scattered away from Westmore. Cell phones emerged to capture the spectacle as agents surrounded the Westmore financial executives. "This is absurd," Westmore sputtered, looking desperately around the room until his gaze landed on Jackson. Understanding dawned in his eyes. "You. This was you." Jackson moved to stand beside Josephine. "Not just me," he replied quietly. "Justice has many agents, Mr. Westmore. Some wear badges, others wear evening gowns." As Brennan recited Miranda rights to a shell-shocked Westmore, Marcus Devlin made a desperate break for freedom, shoving guests aside as he bolted for the kitchen. Two agents tackled him before he reached the doors, bringing him down hard on the polished floor. "You have no idea what you've done," Westmore hissed as agents secured his hands behind his back. "This isn't over." "Actually it is," Josephine replied. "Your offshore accounts have been frozen. Your records have been seized. And the testimony of your former associate," she nodded toward Jackson, "will ensure you never see freedom again." As the agents escorted Westmore and his co-conspirators from the ballroom, the remaining guests erupted in shocked conversation. Camera flashes strobed around the room as the society elite documented the downfall of one of Boston's most powerful. When Josephine turned to Jackson, her face reflecting both triumph and weariness. "It's finally over." "Almost," Jackson corrected her, leading her toward a quiet corner. "There's still the matter of your investment with me." Josephine raised an eyebrow. "My investment?" "The $1 million you put in escrow," Jackson reminded her. "Half to be released upon completion of our arrangement." "Ah, yes." She studied him thoughtfully. "You could have disappeared with the first half at any point during this operation. Why didn't you?" Jackson considered his answer carefully. "Perhaps I discovered there are some things more satisfying than money. Justice, for instance." Robert suggested joining them, among other things, Jackson admitted, "though I wouldn't go so far as to say I've reformed." Josephine smiled knowingly. "Of course not. A leopard doesn't change its spots entirely, but perhaps it can choose which prey to hunt." Agent Brennan approached their small group, looking satisfied despite her professional demeanor. "The technical team has confirmed access to Westmore's private servers. We've recovered Edmund's original files, along with evidence of at least 20 other suspicious deaths connected to their operations." "And the recording?" Josephine asked tensely. "Found exactly where your information said it would be," Brennan confirmed. "A clear threat from Westmore to Edmund dated 3 days before his death. It may not be enough for a murder conviction on its own, but combined with the digitalis evidence and testimony we'll get from flipping some of Westmore's associates, we have a strong case." Josephine closed her eyes briefly, her composure faltering for the first time. Robert placed a steadying hand on her arm. "Thank you, Agent Brennan," she said softly. "Edmund would be grateful." "Don't thank me," Brennan replied, glancing at Jackson. "Your unconventional recruitment methods made this possible, even if they gave my supervisors ulcers." The FBI agent extended her hand to Jackson. "Mr. Chambers, our deal stands. Your cooperation in this case has cleared your record, as promised. As far as the federal government is concerned, you're starting with a clean slate." Jackson shook her hand, a strange feeling of legitimacy washing over him. "What happens now?" "Now?" Brennan smiled slightly. "Now you make a choice about what kind of man you want to be going forward." After the agent departed, Jackson, Josephine, and Robert found themselves alone in a quiet corner of the rapidly emptying ballroom. "So," Josephine said, studying Jackson intently, "what kind of man will you be, now that you're free to choose?" Jackson loosened his bow tie, considering the question. For the first time in his adult life, he had no scheme in progress, no marks identified, no exit strategy planned. The sensation was both liberating and terrifying. "I haven't decided yet," he admitted, "though I seem to have developed a taste for catching con men rather than being one." Robert arched an eyebrow. The Harrington Foundation's Financial Fraud Division could use someone with your unique perspective. The position comes with a legitimate salary, benefits, and the opportunity to use your talents for something constructive. "You're offering me a job?" Jackson asked incredulously. "I'm offering you a purpose," Josephine corrected him. "Something Edmund always said was more valuable than wealth. The chance to protect others from predators like the ones who took him. From me." Jackson found himself genuinely tempted. A novel sensation for a man who had spent his life taking rather than giving. "I'll consider it," he said finally. "But first, I think I need some time to figure out who Jackson Chambers really is when he's not running a con." Josephine nodded in understanding. "The offer has no expiration date. When you're ready, if you're ready, we'll be there." As they prepared to leave the now empty ballroom, Josephine paused, reaching into her evening bag to withdraw a small envelope. "Before I forget, this is yours." Jackson accepted it, finding inside a bank transfer confirmation for $500,000, the second half of their agreed payment. "You didn't have to honor this," he said, surprised. "There's no enforceable contract between us." "There's something more binding than contracts," Josephine replied. "Integrity. Edmund taught me that. Perhaps you can teach it to others someday." 3 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Jackson Chambers walked up the steps of a newly renovated Victorian building in downtown Crimson Valley. The brass plaque beside the door read, "Harrington Foundation Center for Financial Justice and Education." Inside, he found Josephine in a bright office overlooking the town square, reviewing documents with Gloria Calloway, Robert's journalist wife, who had so thoroughly interrogated Jackson at the dinner party. "Ladies," Jackson greeted them with a genuine smile, "I believe I'm here for a job interview." Josephine looked up, her eyes twinkling with satisfaction. "Welcome home, Jackson. We've been expecting you." As he took a seat across from the remarkable 72-year-old widow who had changed the course of his life, Jackson reflected on the irony of his situation. He'd come to Crimson Valley hunting for a wealthy mark and found instead something he never knew he needed: redemption. Sometimes it seemed the hunter truly does become the hunted. And occasionally, that's exactly what they needed all along. Up. Next, you got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.